Hi, my name is Joel Tax. I'm with Reserve Data Analyst, and today we're going to go over the percent funded calculation in a reserve study. Topics being covered today are what is percent funded, risk associated with remaining at low percent funded levels, and other considerations for the percent funded calculation in the reserve study. So what is percent funded? Well, simply it's a mathematical calculation of the adequacy of the reserve account at one point in time. It's how much is actually in the reserve account versus how much ideally would be in the reserve account, again at one particular point in time. This is a simple formula. Percent funded equals the current reserve account balance. That's how much is actually in the reserve account, divided by the fully funded balance, which is an idealized amount in the reserve account. It's an amount that offsets the accumulated deterioration of that component. So let's just break this down real quick in this formula. We have a paint project of $100,000. It's 1 year old. The paint has a useful life of 10 years. So at the end of 10 years, we're going to have to recoat the paint. And at the end of year one, we have a reserve account balance of $5,000. So to create a percent funded figure for this scenario, we take $5,000, which is the reserve account balance, and we divide it by $10,000, which is the fully funded balance at the end of year one in this scenario with a $100,000 paint project. Again, because we're taking that $100,000 and we're dividing into 10, because it's going to last 10 years and we want to spread out that cost amongst the 10 years so everybody is paying their fair share over that time period. In this scenario, $5,000 divided by $10,000 equals 50%. They're 50% funded. They have half of the amount in the reserve account that they ideally would have at the end of year one. They are not on track for paying off that paint project of $100,000 at the end of year 10. So let's look here at an organization that is 100% funded each and every year for the 10-year period. As you can see here, at the end of year one, they have deposited $10,000 in their reserve account. At the end of year two, they have deposited an additional $10,000. So now they have a total of $20,000. At the end of year three, they've deposited an additional $10,000. So now they have $30,000. So on and so forth. Till the end of year 10, they have $100,000 in their reserve account, which is equal to the estimated project cost of $100,000. So they can pay this paint vendor for the project expense. In this scenario, they're 100% funded because they are on track the entire time for paying off this paint project. They've equally spread out the $10,000 in each year so that everybody pays their fair share over time. Now let's look at a community or an organization that decides to allocate half of what they ideally would into the reserve account. In this case, they're allocating $5,000 into the reserve account in each year. End of year one, they have $5,000. End of year two, they have a total of $10,000. End of year three, they have a total of $15,000 in the reserve account. So on and so forth until the end of year 10, when they have a significant shortfall of $55,000. Now ideally, as just in the last example we showed, in year 10, they would be only depositing $10,000 into the reserve account. But because they had decided to underfund the reserve account for the prior 9 years, in the 10th year, they're actually having to make a $55,000 deposit into the reserve account. Now that may well be above what they are able to afford as an organization or community, so they may have to rely on a loan or emergency financing, or they have to do some kind of a special assessment on the membership to make up this shortfall. Again, the project expense is up here. It's $100,000, and that's going to happen whether they are prepared for it or not. So they're going to have to make up in year 10 that lack of funds, as you can see here in red. If that's $55,000, they need to get up to this $100,000 mark. So they're 50% funded in this scenario because they have decided to allocate half of an ideal amount, which would have been $10,000. Instead, they have allocated $5,000. It's important to note that they have year 1 through year 9 had no negative consequences for having a shortfall in the reserve account. They were able to underfund the reserve account for 90% of the life of this component with essentially zero repercussions. It's only in year 10 when they realize, or perhaps they realized before, but it's when it comes to fruition, the actual cost and the lack of the funds to pay for that project expense. Projections for their percent funded figures. This was a typical projection sheet from our reserve study. As you'll see, we have the current cost of components, we have annual contributions to the reserve account, we take into account interest, annual expenditures. Again, annual expenditures, if you only have a few components, they may only happen every few years. If it's a large project expense, maybe only once every 25 or 30 years. So the percent funded figures will fluctuate up and down over time based on when these project expenses occur and the annual contribution to the reserve account, whether that's increasing or decreasing or staying stagnant. That's all going to have a significant impact on your percent funded figures, which are calculated each and every given year. It's important to remember that the percent funded calculation will fluctuate. That's normal for it to fluctuate up and down over a period of time. Common percent funded ranges is 0 to 30%. This is a low funded range where there's a high risk for special assessments, loans, emergency financing being necessary. 30 to 70%. This is where most of the organizations that we run into are situated. Essentially, they can go many years or decades in this fair funded range with little impact until they see a significant shortfall in one particular year. We like to call those peak expense years. And a good funding range. This is where most communities and organizations have the least risk for reliance on loans, special assessments, things like that. It's also important to note, though, that you can also be a high percent funded range, say 70 or 80% funded, and still run into financial issues in respect to the reserve account. If you're 80% funded and you have to make up 20% for a component expense that is projected to happen that very next year, you have to make up 20% difference there to get up to, again, 100% of the cost of the component. So it's really important that we look at projections in the reserve study as well as the percent funded figures. Being a low percent funded for extended period of time carries significant risk. There's cash flow issues, a reliance on loans, special assessments, emergency financing, campaigns. Every organization is a little bit different on how they raise funds, but there's a very high risk associated with that if you remain in a low percent funded range for a significant period of time. And you can be in even a fair funded range for many years and now not have any apparent negative consequences to it until all of a sudden you have a large expense that occurs and there just are not the funds in the reserve account to cover it. Deferred projects are very, very common in a community or organization that has a low percent funded range. They just do not have the money in their reserve account to pay off that project expense, so they push it out. If you push out, say, a paint project 4 or 5 years, you may have flaking paint, you have water intrusion issues, and then all of a sudden you have siding that needs to be replaced that didn't before, or sheathing underneath the siding, or other components that are impacted by water intrusion. So it's important that you take that into consideration if you're going to be deferring projects because of a low percent funded figure because you don't have the money in the reserve account. You should take into account that there's going to be possibly much higher costs associated with deferring a project, and that carries its own risk over time. Marketability and aesthetic appeal issues are extremely common in low percent funded communities and organizations. Buyers as well as people in the community are typically not very happy and pleased by seeing peeling paint, tarps on roofs, potholes in roads, things like that, where a community organization has obviously deferred a project, oftentimes because they just don't have the funds to cover it at the time. That will impact the marketability as well as values. Other considerations for percent funded. Percent funded will fluctuate from year to year. That is normal. That is based on the allocation rate to the reserve account as well as the project expenses. Ideally, we create funding models where the percent funded figure over a significant period of time, say 10, 20, or 30 years, increases to a 100% funded level. But within that period of time, it will absolutely fluctuate up and down, strictly based on the allocation rate to the reserve account and how much the project expenses actually were and which project expenses actually occurred. Percent funded is not the full picture. We need to also look at cash flow. Percent funded, while it's very helpful, you can be in a position where you're, say, in a high percent, a good funded range, 70 to 30 to 100%, where you run out of money because you were not 100% funded at the end of a component's useful life. So you can run into a scenario where a percent funded figure may say 70 or 80%, but you have to make up that remaining 20 or 30% within a 1 year period. In that scenario, if it's a large enough expense, that could be a significant impact on the budgeting for that community organization. So it's important to look at cash flow, how much is actually going to be in the reserve account in each particular year, as well as percent funded. Nothing is set in stone. Significant changes can and will happen to the reserve account, and the percent funded figures will absolutely change based on budgeting decisions. This could be an increase or decrease to the allocation rate, a stagnation to the allocation rate to the reserve account for many years. It could be project expenses that are much higher or lower than what were projected. It could be additional expenses related to those component projects that came up, perhaps be due to deferring a project where you have significantly higher cost. Lastly, be cautious of mathematical gimmicks. It's very easy to go into a component list and change a few numbers and have dramatically different percent funded figures. It's important to note that this has no real impact on the financial situation in the community or organization, but mathematically it's easy to do on paper. You can change the measurements or quantity of components, you can change the useful life of components, you can change the remaining useful life of components, and you can change the cost of the components. Any of those, if you make a significant change to large project cost, that's going to have a significant impact on the percent funded figures. So it's really important that we are cautious of mathematical gimmicks. I like to call it tinkering with the numbers, because you can end up with budget that looks great on paper, and you're able to get away with for many years before the actual project expense occurs. And then in those years they find out, well, we've been under budgeting to the reserve account for many years at this point because we just don't have the money in the reserve account, even though those prior years it looked good on paper. So it's really important we are very cautious of gimmicks. So that's about it for this presentation. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you have any questions, you can call or email. I strongly suggest also looking at the fully funded balance presentation that goes into that figure. Since that's part of this formula, percent funded, it's important to know both aspects to get a full understanding of the methodology that we're using. Thank you so much.